And so, Chuck, would you begin with some lessons, just a few thoughts on lessons for small communities as we kick off our office hour session today?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Norm. It is, I looked through the little thing you sent me this morning because I got in at 2 a.m. last night from returning from Norman. And so I got up this morning and Norm said, "Oh, we're doing this at noon." And I thought, okay, well, I'd better get moving then. I looked at the stuff and the questions the topics are really in my wheelhouse. When we think about small towns, for me, from a strong town standpoint, there's the idea that a small town is a small version of a big city is just incorrect. When we look at zoning, when we look at programs that the state puts together, or the federal government puts together, or what have you, what we tend to experience is, well, this works in a large metro area, and a small town is just a shrunk down version of a large metro area. And the reality is that's not the case. It's not even that they're two completely different entities. And I think of it sometimes in terms of like physics, where you have the large body thing, and then you have quantum, and they're not the same in any way. I think sometimes we treat them like they're Newtonian, like they're both the same and they follow certain rules. And then when you start working on them, they don't. And let me give you like the clearest example of this. If you are a planner, let's just use a planner. If you are a professional planner working in a big metro area, and you do something where you lose your job, or your job is threatened because the city doesn't like you anymore, the mayor and city council changed over, they want to go in a different direction, and you wind up leaving that place or losing your job. There are, in a major metropolitan area, I'm from Minnesota, so in Minneapolis, St. Paul, we see planners move around all the time. And there's no stigma to that. There's no problem with that. It's like, it didn't work out there. You go over there. Oh, it works great over there, that kind of thing. There's tons of jobs and opportunities and other things going on. If you are in a small town and you have a change of city council and you lose your job, or it's just not working out, or it's not like the right fit, or they ran for city council to get rid of you because they didn't like the policies of the last administration and they're blaming you for it. There's nothing else for you to do. You're either switching careers, or you are moving to an entirely different city, uprooting your family, uprooting your kids from school. This is a massive change. And that has a very different effect on how cities are planned, how we relate to each other, how we go about assembling things, how we even talk about stuff. So these are vastly different kind of systems. And I feel like there is no real, I know people have written books on small towns and there's some really good stuff out there. I know people have there's a small town planning manual that's, 80% really good. I like it. It's got some insights. But there is really no body of practice for small towns in the post-World War II suburban experiment kind of age. We treat them as micro versions of large cities, and they're very much not.
I think that's a great intro, and I think it leads directly in our first question from Chris Robbins, who's from Middlebury, Vermont. And Chris asks, my town, a population of 8,600, is strong in many ways. We have shared parking downtown. We allow ADUs everywhere, which is fantastic. But my question is about enforcement. The Development Review Board likes to put a lot of conditions on approvals, but if the property owners don't comply, there's little recourse. We can't afford lawyers. Are there any clever ways to get compliance? Or, he suggests, maybe not rely so much on conditions?
Yeah. I would say maybe not rely so much on conditions. Enforcement is always, in large systems and small systems, it's always the hard thing. I think in larger systems, it's a little bit easier than in smaller ones because you've got a kind of quantities of scale. And we see in small towns that it's really hard to enforce things. There's the appeals process. People will come to City Hall, want to talk to the mayor. in a small town, you can talk to the mayor, you can talk to city council, they'll sit and listen to you. It makes all that stuff very, very personal. Ideally, what you want to get to is a point where your regulatory process bifurcates in two ways. You either have things that if they're screwed up, it will be a really bad thing for a really long time. Like it can't fix itself. And then you will have B, things that if they get messed up and screwed up, have an opportunity to fix themselves over time. Let me give you an example of each of these. The placement of a building. If we don't get the placement of the building right, if we set it back too far, put the parking lot in front, if we have a big wall with no opacity, no windows along a street where there's people walking, that's going to be screwed up for lifetimes, right? Like that will never be fixed. Like there's nothing in a small town that's going to fix that. If they get the siding wrong or the paint wrong or the sign is goofed up or like whatever it is, those are things that over time will change. And I actually think that, particularly in a small town setting, culture and kind of just social norms in a place will do more to help you on that side than strict regulation will do. I don't want us from a regulatory process to burn through our energy, to burn through our clout, to burn through our capacity, trying to deal with this second stuff, this group of things that will evolve and fix themselves. I want us to be really, really intent and really focus on that first set of things, the things that if we screw up are going to be screwed up for a long, long time. When people come in with applications, I would almost say, these are the things you have to meet. And there really is like, we're going to do very little negotiating with this. And that would probably be an expansion off of what we require now. And then these are the things that are going to be recommendations or guidelines and suggestions, but we're never going to make them conditions of approval. We're never going to put this huge burden on our very small bureaucracy and our very small, like intimate culture here to go out and enforce those things and all that. So pick your battles, but when you pick a battle, make it the right battle and make it a battle that you're willing to really fight on. Rural by Design is a great book. The follow-up to, I think there's a second version of it. I'm looking over on my shelf because I've got it here. It is a very good book. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Then our next question is from Angel Castillo, who's in Ogden, Utah, which I did have to look up is a lot larger than the previous town. Is 86,000 people. But she said, how do we get city councils to stop rubber stamping bad economic development deals? And so she gives the example in Ogden, they're on the edge of a $160 million bond to pay for 2 parking decks, 300 luxury apartments, office space and commercial with no feasibility study or economic impact report. And I chatted with Angel and she said, it's also within an opportunity zone. And so when you sort of have all of these chips on the table, how do strong citizens emerge to try to breathe some sense into this?
Yeah. One thing to note, when we say small town, a lot of people think they live in a small town. And then when you say the size of it, other people will go like, that's not a small town, that's huge. I live in Brainerd, Minnesota, population 13,500. We are the big city, the big town for like all kinds of places around here that are 1,000 people or 500 people or what have you. We look at St. Cloud, population 60,000 as being like the big city. I remember we used to go to St. Cloud to buy our school clothes because that was the place had all the shopping. And of course, you know, in St. Cloud, they consider themselves a small town and they look at the Twin Cities metro area as being the big city. So we all have our own definition and I think we should embrace that. I was with Ian Rasmussen, one of our board members here at Strong Towns, and he lives in he lived in Queens in a neighborhood, and he called his neighborhood in Queens a small town. And I'm like, oh, that's really cute, but I don't know, like I don't get it. So this question of economic development, how do we stop our government from rubber stamping bad economic development? I'm going to say something that is going to be very frustrating and unrewarding for people. And that is that you really can't, if you have a government that is their mindset is like, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it. There's no set of arguments or memes or rational discussion that is going to stop them from doing it, like say in the next 6 months. Like it's just, there's no easy way to flip that switch. You get places where that's the internal culture of the system. That's the mindset of the people who have been elected. And you can give them reports that say like, these are bad projects. These are projects that are going to make our city poorer, are putting us on the wrong track. And they won't believe them. And they won't believe them because they have experienced, here's the positive things that happen when we grow in this way, and this is what we're committed to doing, and this is, what I believe, and on and on. The only way to change this is to change the cultural conversation around it. At Strong Towns, we talk about 3 different centers of power in a community. And that you have to have 2 of the 3 on board to see any kind of real sustained positive change. There is the elected officials, and we can identify them as decision makers. There is the staff, the professional staff that are advising them. And I would expand that a little bit to include people like the head of the Chamber of Commerce and the head of the Rotary Club and the president of the bank, and like this kind of layer of influencers that directly influence the elected officials. And then the third is the general public. You have to have 2 of those 3 on board to make any change in any sustained way. If you have great leadership, but the public is not with them and the staff is not with them, they're going to flail around, and then they're going to lose the next election. So in places where we want to see broad systematic change, we continue to approve these things. It's really bad. I'm really frustrated by it. The thing that we need to do then is start working on that public conversation. We need to have a conversation with our neighbors. We need to have a conversation with business owners in our community, with advocacy organizations in our community, with nonprofits in our community, with the churches, with the synagogues, with every place where people gather. We need to go and start having conversations about what a different vision could look like. I often get asked, like, is there and I'm going to personify what I'm asked, is there a magical incantation that we can say, like, Chuck, you're so smart and well-spoken, could you come and just say these things to our city? And then they would do something different. And it doesn't work that way. Like, this is not the wizarding world of Strong Towns, where there's some, what's the one where you can control someone's mind? Like, we don't get to do that here. We have to actually do this harder work of sharing ideas. We do have the local conversations program, which I know that everybody here probably knows something about. I will just say that our entire organization is designed around giving people the tools and the capacity to shift their conversation locally. So all of our content is free. All of our stuff that we do is accessible to anyone. And it's all Creative Commons licensed so that you can use it without coming to us and asking permission or doing anything like that. Start just by talking to your neighbors. And that's the most powerful thing we can do right now. I know that's frustrating because you would like to be able to like put out a report and have it say, this is a really dumb project. And then people say, oh, yeah, it is a really dumb project. We won't do it. I think they all probably know it's a really dumb project, but they don't feel like there's an alternative. And we got to show them that there is.
Yeah, it's a great convicting point, and I'll drop a link to the Strong Towns local conversations group. We've had over 500 inquiries in the last month or a couple months, and it's just blowing up because people are saying, like, I want to be able to chat about this where I live. Now a question from Ann Keenan, who's in Nacogdoches, Texas, and Ann taught me how to say that town name properly. And she asks, do you have any advice on how to provide more jobs and get young people to stay? Whether that's remote workers, or are there ideas we haven't thought about? How do we revitalize small communities?
I love this question. And Nacogdoches is a place that I've really, it's come across my radar many, many times. I've not been, Anne, and I really want to get there. There's a lot of these places in Texas that I've contacted. I've never been to El Paso. I really want to get to El Paso at some point. let me talk about this because the brain drain, as it's sometimes called, is both A, overblown, and B, very real and very hurtful in our hearts for small town people. I'm raising these two daughters, and I started the conversation today by saying I'm trying to influence the one to maybe where to go to college. We've had these conversations in my household about what the future of our kids is going to be. And one of the things that is very sad to me is that the vision that we have for them that looks like success does not include being part of this community, does not include them coming back here. And that makes me really, really sad. How do we keep people here? I feel like there's two things that come to mind right away. The first one is to recognize that what young people need more than anything else is not a jobs program or an industry or a business park or, all these things that I think we traditionally do to try to grow jobs and keep our youth here. What they need more than anything else is hope for the future, that it will be better than what they have today. If I can see myself working in a place and having those efforts pay off in terms of this place being better in the future, then I'm going to stick around. I'm going to have more incentive to stick around. If the place itself feels mired in its own kind of decline, chasing the next big project, doing the thing that has failed over and over again, unwilling to change or reform, or having kind of the old boys club, the old boys network, and city council meetings are just the guys who have been there for 20 years. If it just feels like it's gonna always be a long, slow decline, then the advertising of like, there's this job here, or there's this thing here, it's not going to matter. People are not going to see something in the future that they can contribute to that will be better. The other thing that I think that is really important is that we need to give young people alternatives to how do I say this? Alternatives to the life that their parents had, right? I go to city council meetings all the time. I go to public meetings all the time. And you hear these crazy things like, well, we have to have a parking lot, or we can, if we have duplexes, it'll freak people out. And when you step back and look, I'm 49 years old. It's always people older than me who, in a sense, are saying, when, everybody here wants to live like I do. And if we don't build what I am doing now, it will freak everybody out and they won't like it. Those people are very sensitive to their peers and the people in their age group, but they're not listening to people who are younger. I think that if we start listening to people that are younger, what we will see is that a lot of the strong towns kind of core approach of building cities that are walkable, building cities that are connected, building cities incrementally where you can start small and build up, having things be a little bit messier, embracing public space and a little bit of art and a little bit of, hanging out and getting together. These are the things that invite and entice people to want to be part of something. It is the experience they often go to a big city to have, right? Andres Duani once said in a thing I was in, he's like, young people move from small towns to big cities because they're looking for people to swap DNA with and hang out and do fun things. I think that the less our cities are about hanging out and doing fun things for young people, and the more we try to put them into 30-year mortgages and single family homes and 2-car families and driving to the strip mall, the more we like push that as like the only viable alternative in this place, the fewer options we give them that really reconcile with their life. So in summary, be a fun, funky place. Allow them to like lead that, and don't squash it. If you can do that, it's going to be really, really great. And let them see a future that is not going to be like the greatest place on earth. You don't have to have, you don't have to be on a track to become the greatest city in North America. They just have to be able to see that things are going to improve, and that their existence in that place will be part of that improvement process. Then they'll stay.
And in time, they'll learn to love the place that they live and find ways to invest in it. And yeah,
they'll love it desperately. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, we've always said a good life in a prosperous place is what people are after at the core. And a good life means I can do things of meaning.
Yeah.
And a prosperous place means when I do things of meaning, it will make the place better. That's all. And so if you're trying to get to be a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10 and you're at a 1, people will stay if they feel like I can do things, and those things will result in us getting to 2.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a high bar for any of us.
And it's an interesting marketing slogan. Nacogdoches, a great place to swap DNA. So
a great place to swap DNA.
Yeah.
You know, it's part of the human experience, right?
Yeah. Another part of the human experience is needing water. And Jean Schwensen from Greenlee, Arizona, asked this question. She said, there's about 10,000 people that live in the area. Jean described it that it's a fairly sprawling sort of area. And she said, our main infrastructure in this very rural county is individual wells and septic systems. Water and water rights are an ever increasing concern. This essentially demands spreading people out because of the way in which water is extracted and the way in which it needs to be percolated back in. But there are still the roads to maintain, so the spreading adds costs. Do we have any incremental ideas on how to work on these competing poles?
I wish I had an answer. Unfortunately, like physics does, push us in one of 2 directions, always, in terms of human settlement. It pushes us to the very dilute or the very concentrated. And there's really nothing else that works. The closer you are in between, the less it works. Again, I'll quote Andres because I think he said something very genius about 2 decades ago that I was sitting in the room going, okay, wow. In planning and zoning, especially in environmental regulatory realms, what we see is that less is better. And there's this mindset that dilution is the solution to pollution, right? That's an old engineering saying. And the way this tends to work itself out through a regulatory process is if you allow half-acre lots, wow, 1-acre lots would be better. And if you allow 1-acre lots, wow, 2-acre lots would be better. And if you allow 2-acre lots, if we could somehow get to 5-acre lots, that would be better because we're diluting things more. We're getting closer to the ideal. And what Andres Dwani pointed out to me was that that's actually like a fallacy. The ideal, if we put a scale right now, we're saying the more dilute you get, the better it becomes. There's actually a more nuanced way of saying the ideal would be wilderness untouched, right? From an environmental standpoint, wilderness or high concentrations of people where you actually have enough wealth and productivity being produced where you can address the externalities, the problems that arise from human settlement. If you think of those 2 poles as like the best that we're going to get, everything that varies from that tends to become more and more problematic. So whenever you're dealing with this half-acre lot, 1 acre, 2-acre, 5-acre kind of thing, you're in the middle and you're actually in the place that is the most difficult to work in. So in my mind, and I'm talking theoretically now, I realize that in small town Arizona, there's practicalities on the ground. that are difficult to deal with. But if you said we could start from scratch and say we're going to design Arizona, you would have minimum lot sizes of 40 acres or 80 acres or 160 acres or something like that, where extracting water would not be impactful. And, dealing with the sewage and the runoff and all that would have essentially no impact. And then you would have the other end of the spectrum where you would be building really great cities that would have, all the wealth and productivity needed to provide the water that you needed and provide the sewage treatment and handle stormwater and those kind of crazy big rain events that you get out there. When you're dealing in the middle, I don't have an answer for that, because, it's almost death by 1,000 cuts. And I could say, if you're having death by 1,000 cuts, death by 500 cuts maybe buys you more time, but it gets you to the same destination ultimately, right? It's a very hard problem, and I don't think I have a solution, in as much as trying to move to one of those ends it should be our overarching policy. Does that make sense, Norm?
Yeah, that really does. And I mean, to be clear, we're not saying like only tall, compact structures and untouched wilderness, but that we live within that continuum. But the further that we go right into that murky middle, the more difficult it is to deliver any level of service, let alone things that are needed just for human habitation, as we're seeing like core needs emerging in the American Southwest that I think are going to become even more pronounced.
It's definitely not about big cities, right? Because you can have, and I think if we go back and look at original settlements in desert kind of areas, these were small outpost kind of places. There was no verticality to them at all. But what they were is it was a concentration of people and a concentration of, in our terms, we would say wealth productivity, that allowed you to do collective things in a way that you could financially, you could sustain over time financially, right? You could take care of the water, because there's only two ways, to get water in a desert. And you're either going to have some individual type approach that is going to be detrimentally affected by, in a sense, having everybody else around you do that same thing, or you can have some kind of collective approach where you can have a lot of people together and manage it in that way. I mean, there really is there's no other alternative to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, that certainly leads directly into Jake's question. Jake asks, is suburban housing on the edge of small towns better than no growth at all? Some really small towns are desperately trying to stop shrinking. Their populations have shrunk within the town because there are fewer occupants per home. And so the question is, many places would rather subsidize suburban houses on large lots and become a bedroom community for larger cities than be faced with the prospect of not growing. What policy should be paired with that kind of development to actually build wealth in the town?
It's a really hard question. It's a very real question, because a lot of places are barely hanging on. And in these places that are barely hanging on, when someone comes and says, I give you this like tainted water or poison fruit, right? You're like, well, I'm starving. I'm desperately thirsty. Like I'll take it, even though it will have bad ramifications for me. I get that level of desperation. The book Rural by Design was brought up earlier, and Rural by Design by Randall Arndt was an attempt to try to have your cake and eat it too. Again, if I'm going to quote Andres, I've quoted Andres Duany 3 times now. He called Rural by Design putting lipstick on a pig, which I think was rather harsh, but let me explain what he meant by that. Rural by Design is saying, if you were going to build these kind of things on the outskirts of small towns, let's do them in such a way where we can preserve green space, limit the amount of infrastructure we're putting into them, and essentially take something that, if it was just a standard, suburban subdivision on the edge of a city would be all bad and make it less bad, or in some ways a net good. Dwani's critique is that we shouldn't be doing this at all. Like, this is really just unhelpful style development. And I tend to be in that Andre's camp. I tend to think that this is putting lipstick on a pig, but sometimes your community is going to insist on a pig, right? And like, how do you make it the least painful thing that you can? Ideally, if we were in a small town, second ring, third ring, further out suburb of a metro area, or if we were just a small town in, the hinterland, we would say no to these developments. And understanding the culture of these places, it's impossible to say no to them without saying yes aggressively to something else. And so to put ourselves in a position where we can credibly say no to this, we actually have to be focusing aggressively on what we say yes to. How do we make the yes part of this work? How do we take the existing infrastructure we have, make better use of it? How do we put homes in there? How do we put business opportunities in there? How do we thicken up that streetscape? How, when we do that, do we make it a better place to live, improve our parks, improve our, just the quality of life of being in that place? How do we aggressively say yes to that so that we can, with credibility, say no to the other? If we're not there yet, like if we haven't done the work yet to be able to say yes to this and no to that, then things like rural by design to me are a good conversation starter for how do we do the bad stuff less bad, maybe, to put it that way. How do we do this in a way that costs us the least amount? And I would just say, whenever we are inviting people into our small town, there's a certain cultural exchange that goes on, right? And I'm gonna put it like this, because of the way this question was framed. I've been here, I've been in this place. Our small town is struggling. We're declining. Oh my gosh, somebody wants to be part of us. That's almost like a validation. Someone loves me, someone likes me. And there's a certain desperation, like being the last person picked on the softball team, or the person at the school dance standing on the side that no one wants to dance with, that all of a sudden someone comes up and says, would you dance with me? Would you be on my softball team? That has a certain like, ooh, they love me. Like I'm happy about myself at this point. That's a very human thing, particularly in a small town, particularly when you feel like, we're moving in the wrong direction. That human thing really comes down to a self-esteem kind of thing more than anything else. And I do think in small towns, we need to work on our self-esteem if we're going to do really smart things or really, valuable, productive things in our land use pattern. That sounds like therapy almost, right? Like, you're good enough, people like you kind of thing. But I do think there's an aspect of that. And if we want to be able to say no to the thing that is bad, we need to spend, I always tell places, if you've got 10 hours of time, you shouldn't spend 9 hours fighting the thing that is bad and 1 hour building the alternative. You should spend 9.5 hours aggressively building like the really great alternative thing that is going to make you strong and prosperous, and half an hour fighting the thing that won't. Because if that's the only option, that's what people are going to do.
So then this might be one of those half-hour discussions, or the questions of, spending, if you have 10 hours, 9.5 focus on building better places, stronger places, healthier communities. But a question from Jake is, at what point should we try to get highways removed from our small town main streets? Do we advocate for highway removal, even if it means suburban commercial development ends up at the edges of town rather than flocking into the middle?
Interesting. Okay, that second part of the question didn't make a lot of sense to me, but let me deal with the first part, and then we'll try to delve into the second part a little bit. immediately, right? Like our DOTs have done more damage to small towns than anything. And I think in terms of getting the highways removed, I wouldn't even like worry about that. I would just worry about how do we get the speeds down? How do we get it to be less like a highway for the 2 blocks, 4 blocks, 8 blocks, 1 mile in the middle of town? Putting placards out, putting out, stuff as close to the right of way as we can. I was at a town in Wyoming, and the highway through the middle of town was just bizarrely wide, and it was just, come on. The DOT was just being a real pain in the neck about it. And the city was in a sense like pushing back by just letting the businesses put their signs out out in this. They were like artificially like narrowing things up and just going out with the little placard signs and putting them out and having street seating. And the DOT would flip out and they come out like, you can't do this. And so they would move it back. And then when they would leave, they would put it back out again. Because like what are you going to do? Like the traffic volume is really low. It's not like it was a safety issue. It was actually safer with the stuff out there. And the DOT has limited budget and limited resources. We go back to the enforcement question we got earlier. They're sitting around going, how do we make this city stop doing this? Eventually you're not going to. So I think we need to get very aggressive in pushing back on the DOTs and demanding that the travel speeds through our small towns, through the core of our small towns, are safe speeds. So less than 20 miles an hour. And I feel like a local mayor, a local city council, particularly, can make this a safety priority, right? Like I'm the mayor of Brainerd, Minnesota. I'm going to go to the DOT and say, you are killing my residents. You are threatening my residents by having this highway designed where people are driving 30, 35, 40 miles an hour through the middle of my city. And I will not tolerate it. I will not tolerate it. And if you're going to tell me I can't put this placard up in the middle of the street where people are crossing to constrain things and slow things down a little bit, then give me your solution. I feel like as local governments, when we allow ourselves to be the algae in the government food chain and like, well, the state says we have to do this and the DOT says we have to do this and we're not recognizing the power we have. We are the highest level of advocacy for the community. And we can go to the DOT and say, I demand this, and I'm going to force the issue, right? I think it's never too early. And I think there's very few things that we can do that would be too aggressive. Now, in terms of the, like, if we push back and make this, are we going to get suburban development on the edge? I don't know why those two things would go together. I also don't know why you would get suburban development in the city. I mean, ultimately what we want is we want a park once kind of place where, there's an advantage for the commercial businesses themselves to being part of a park once kind of city. So we should not be having the strip mall suburban-esque parking lot first style of development in either locations. They're not going to be beneficial for us in either place. Is that fair, Norm?
Yep. But I've got the other question for you. Mark from Jasper, Indiana, which Jasper, by the way, was our strongest town winner this past year. And Chuck did an event there. And Mark from Jasper says, the state DOT is planning to put in a bypass around Jasper on one of the major highways there. And he said, I'm worried about the costly and negative impact this will have on the county and our city. What are your thoughts regarding this type of project and the economic development group that pushes it as something we need for economic growth? So the expansion of the highway project, but at the same time, the concern that if it bypasses the community, that puts the community at risk.
Yeah. It's really, these are really hard questions. And I often see where we make it very black and white. Like at the local level, there will be a group that I'm pro bypass, and there'll be a group that I'm pro through town. And they will kind of start to coalesce around these positions as absolute goods, right? Like, this is clearly what we need to do. This is clear. It is far murkier than that. Having a bypass of the city will do deep damage to the economic center that has grown up around it, because, there are a lot of trips that happen organically now today through the middle of the community that will no longer be there, that will no longer be part of it. And you can compensate for that by, and I mean, I think we should, you can compensate for that by over time building a city that is a park once kind of place, is a place where you could live in the ecosystem of the core of the city with only one vehicle instead of two in a family, where you could drive. I live in the core of the city. I put 6,000 miles a year on my car, and 5,000 of that is driving to the airport, right? Like, I don't drive. I don't have to drive. You can build a city like that and kind of, in a sense, overcome the loss of the through traffic by, or the passive traffic, by having, in a sense, a larger capture of the local share of the economy. But that will not happen overnight, right? That's a generational shift. On the other hand, the idea that the highway should continue to run through the middle of town is also like deeply, deeply problematic. In most small towns, what you have is 90% plus of the traffic are people who have no sense of stopping. They will not stop. They're people who are using, they're using your house as a pass through, right? And you would be better off having them not there at all, because they're just a net negative. The tough thing about these types of conversations is that they happen in a binary way, right? Like, it would be really, really great if we could, over time, transition to a bypass. A bypass with a great city is way better than a city with a highway through the middle of it. I mean, that as an end state, but it's that transition period that is so, so difficult. If this is going to happen to Jasper, I would say two things in response. One, Jasper is already way ahead of where most cities would be when this happens to them. You have a great core. You have really good parks. You've got really interesting stuff going on. You have, in a sense, a strong town that is getting stronger already. You're many steps along the path of having this work out well. Lean into that. Lean into building more housing around that. Lean into thickening up your neighborhoods. Lean into that local stuff, and make the idea that the people who live in Jasper would not ever need to leave Jasper as being like a high priority. The other thing, though, and this is going to come as even for a great place like Jasper with great leadership and great government, this is going to be a hard challenge. You have to not be enticed by developing the bypass route. As you do this, there are going to be a lot of land speculators that are going to come in and buy up this land cheap. It's going to be cheap for them. It's going to feel expensive for people that are there. You're going to have old timers who own land who can sell it for way more than what they got it for, and they're your friends, and they go to the same, worship celebration as you, and you're going to want to help them out. Walmart's going to want to buy that property. Home Depot's going to want to buy that property, et cetera, et cetera. The more you do that, the more you are making your other strategy more difficult. And so there's this temptation to kind of cash in quickly on the bypass at the expense of your long-term strategy. And I'm just going to recommend highly that you push back against that temptation. There's a beautiful hardware store in the downtown of Jasper. It's funky. It's weird. It's owned by an elderly couple. When I was there, someone had accidentally driven through the side of their building and did like great damage to it, and they were getting it fixed. This is not a place where you're going to go get like the latest thing you can get at Home Depot, but it is a place you can go and say, I've got this really odd fuse that I need, or this really weird nut or bolt that I need. Do you have that? And they'll dig through, the thing and find it. I would hold that place up as a place that needs like another generation, right? And how do we get a place like that to not only have a next generation purchase it and modernize it, make it better, keep it going? We would never get that by having the bypass, a bypass put in and then developed with competitors. Sorry, Norm, that got a little rambly, but
no, I appreciate it. Yeah, no, that's great. We're going to take maybe two quick questions. Well, I say quick, but there's no quick things. But Chris is in Steinbach, Manitoba. It's a smaller community. And he said, we're having a lot of focus shifting to the introduction of new taxi companies and probably ride hailing services and things like that. And that those are being used as reasons why their smaller community ought not to invest in local transit options. So that might be a bus route, or that might be other types of transportation. What would you suggest in terms of that? And he said it's also coming at the cost even of safe and accessible walking or cycling investments.
I feel like, the goal here is having people be able to move around, right? So it doesn't, there's nothing in my brain, particularly in a small town setting, that says transit over taxis is great, right? Like and in many ways, like a taxi might be better in a small town setting. I think what stands out to me in this question is the bike walk thing, right? Because there is a huge difference between bike walk and taxi, or bike walk and transit, in terms of mobility in a small town setting. And I realize that we have people on here whose small town definition is 500 people, and also whose definition is 100,000. I'm thinking of small towns in more of the 20,000 and below range. If you're 20,000 and below, there's nothing inaccessible in your city by bike in terms of like range, right? That might be inaccessible in terms of design, right? Like it's really hard to get to, or it's dangerous to go, or what have you. But there's nothing in a small town setting that geographically you can't reach by bike in a way that would be convenient. A 2 mile, a 2 mile bike ride, even a 3 mile bike ride, is not a big deal in almost every setting. And so if we are saying we're shunning transit and embracing taxis because we think the auto-oriented nature of the community is the primary goal, we're doing something really destructive. If we are embracing taxis and not transit because we say the transit option really is a very expensive one that's not going to work well here, and we're going to take that money and put it into making the city more bikeable and walkable, because a bikeable, walkable place will ultimately support transit. I think that's a really bright strategy. Like go for the taxis, embrace the taxis, right? Like I think the taxis will help you bridge a gap. We always say, if you want great transit, you have to build a great place. I think that is more true in a small town than any place else. And the whole like dial-a-ride concept, to me is just like a crappy, it's a junky version of a taxi that comes at like 10 times the cost and provides really bad service. I don't like it. And I get frustrated when small towns embrace it as like some type of solution. Now, there's a cost standpoint, and if people have to pay for taxis and they can't afford it, then I think there's a whole conversation around that. How do we make these rides affordable? How do we help people out who have these mobility needs? But if you said small town transportation strategy, Chuck, go, I'm saying walking, biking, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 through 10, and then maybe we talk transit. Transit will be supported by everything you do for biking and walking.
So
You can't say the opposite.
not a fleet of robo taxis or something like that. I mean,
I
there's
mean,
grand ambitions for that, but it'll be on its way. So
yeah.
we're almost at the top of the hour, but I want to take this. Actually, this serves as a transition question because the next time that Chuck is back, I want him to talk about strong towns within the context of large cities. And so David has asked this question: do principles that support small towns and flourishing places apply to small downtown cores within larger cities? And so is there a way actually to become somewhat to apply focus to a downtown area, almost as if it were like a small village or a small place? And how do we process those types of applications?
No doubt. I mean, this is always, it's funny because we get this criticism all the time. Strong towns is just about small places. Strong towns is just about large cities. Strong towns is just about, downtown. Strong towns is just about the suburbs. And it's like, no. We chose the word town. We put strong towns as our name because a big city is merely a collection of towns. I mean, it literally is like a collection of neighborhoods, each of which kind of function like a town. So yes, if you are in a large city and you're like, I want to apply these concepts and principles, think of it in terms of neighborhoods. And a downtown, like a core neighborhood, is going to be maybe a little bit more mature and commercial focused than a neighborhood adjacent to that, which may have more residential and just limited like neighborhood kind of commercial. But the reality is that in a system that evolves over time, there's kind of a thickening up process where they all kind of, I say, there's the pop-up shack and there's Manhattan and there's a whole like range of places in between, but they're all like maturing toward each other. So yeah, think of your downtown as, the iteration, and ask what's the next version of this place? What's the next level of maturing of this place? And what does that look like?
That's great. I think we're going to wrap up here. Chuck, with your closing thoughts on lessons for small communities. I really appreciate the way that you, I definitely threw some big questions at you and you swung for the fences. So well done. And any closing thoughts?
My heart is in small town America, right? And I think the thing that makes me, I don't want to end on a depressing note, so I'll try not. I'll say this and then I'll try to recover from it. I have been quoted many times as saying, I think we're going to lose half of our small towns over the next generation. I think they're going to go away because they are searching for a reason to exist. They have been really victimized by the post-war development pattern. The things we have done to help them have made their long-term situation and their long-term prognosis worse. And the sad thing is we have a very small margin for error in small towns, and we've consumed much of that over the preceding decades. That being said, small towns are so beautiful. And one of the things that enchants me about them is that you have the capacity to be a huge difference maker in a small town the way that you can't do often in a big city. You can not only meet with the mayor and the city council, but you can talk to everybody who ever influences them. You can start your own group and have it be the player at the table within 6 months, just by being kind to others. You can really have a huge effect on the future of your place just by being present and by loving it and by caring for it. We talked about earlier what a good life in a prosperous place looks like. The idea that you can commit to doing good in a place and have that result in the place getting better. It's harder to make that case for someone who lives in a neighborhood of Chicago than it is for someone who lives in a small town. Because in a small town, one person can make a huge difference. And I guess that's what I would leave people with, is that if you love your small town, if you care about it, if it matters to you, you should feel a sense of urgency, because I think all small towns are really deeply threatened right now. But you should also feel a sense of optimism that if you want to spend the time and want to spend the energy and are willing to, in a sense, humble yourself to try to understand where people are really struggling, to be a kind, generous person that works with others, that is not going to bring like a hard partisan kind of edge to things, but really a more, how do we bring people together and how do we get stuff done in a very bottom up way? Your efforts can be utterly transformative, and that should encourage all of us to an extent. So thank you for picking this topic, Norm, and letting me talk about it. Cause I live in this city. One of the most often asked questions that I get from my friends is, why do you live there? Chuck, why don't you go live in a really nice place? Why don't you go live in some big city? Why don't you go live in a place that would love to have you? You know, there's all these places. And I say, like, this is my home. Like, I love it here. Grew up here. My family's here. I wrote in my book about how I walk by walk through the cemetery where my grandparents are buried, right? Like, my church is right, like literally out the window here. My office is in the junior high where I met my wife when we were 14 years old, like right up the hall from where my office is. This is my place. And I wish that everybody could experience as much joy that you get from loving a place as I experience here. Mm-hmm. That would be my wish for everybody, even though it doesn't often love me back. And even though it's very frustrated, and even though it sometimes hates on me, right? Like, that's part of the deal. There's a lot of love. So thank you, Norm.
Yeah, you're welcome. You said, love your place and it will love you in return. But even just like any human relationship, it's not always constant, but it is meaningful.
Right.
And
yeah.
There's that value in
it.
I know you're pressed for time, so I really appreciate that you had this, we're able to carve out this hour. I hope also that you get a chance to rest, but thank you so much. And I see just tons of encouraging comments in the chat as well. Closing out, like I said in the chat, there's going to be the after party, so I'll hang out for another 30-45 minutes. Chuck doesn't know that I do this for my job, which is just hang out with people, but it is fantastic. And
I'm grateful.
Again, we'll see you next week. Next week is Strong Towns and Faith Communities. And so that's going to be open to religious, as I said in the chat, religious and non-religious folks alike, but all about how do we mobilize communities to take this on together.